Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's presentation of Community School District 25 Family Workshop, Understanding Disability Classifications and Special Education Eligibility. We are joined tonight by the Interim Acting Superintendent, Dr. D'Antona, and we'd like to start with a few words from him first.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nathan, and good evening, everyone. Super excited that you're able to join us tonight as we share a little bit more information around the special education process, classification, and eligibility. You know, during this earlier today, we did host a very similar session for a group of people this morning, and it was really terrific hearing the questions that they were asking. So I encourage you in the audience tonight, you know, if there are questions that do come up, please don't hesitate, add them to the chat, or when opportunities present themselves to come off of mute. You know, please get those questions out there, as it will not only help you, it very well may likely help one of the other parents that are here tonight. So again, I thank you for being here, and I'm hoping you find this evening's session helpful. Thank you, Nathan.
Thank you, Dr. D'Antona. Welcome everyone again to our second in a series of Family Workshop series. We had previously spoken about the IEP process, and today we'll be delving a little bit deeper into the IEP. My name is Nathan Yakubov, and I'm the Administrator of Special Education for District 25. My contact information is on the screen. You can always feel free to reach out to me for support and questions about evaluations, special education services, assistive technology, or placement questions. I support the schools directly as well with all of their special education needs as well. The presentation was co-created with our supervisor of school psychologists, Melissa Monaco. She was not able to participate in this evening's presentation. However, her contact information is there, so you can feel free to reach out to her with any questions related to special education as well for your child in their school. Okay. So as I stated, this is the second in the series. Last time we spoke about the individualized education program. So just to kind of recap before we go into this presentation, all students with disabilities who require special education services have an individualized education program, an IEP. And the IEP is a legal document which contains information about your child's interests, their strengths, their needs, their goals, and the educational program that we are setting forth for them. As I said, it's a legal document and it describes how the Department of Education will provide your child with a free and appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment, which means that we strive to provide the services necessary as close to typically developing students as possible, and as much in the same environment as typically developing students. As I mentioned, today we'll be going into the classifications and eligibility of special education services, which would entitle you to have an IEP, your student to have an IEP and receive services. So the first question is the eligibility. How does a student become eligible for special education and special education services? In order to be eligible, they have to meet one of the criteria for disability classifications. And the disability classification, which we'll talk about more in the presentation, is determined by the Committee for Special Education. In New York City, the Committee for Special Education is usually referred to as the IEP team. The IEP team consists of the parent, the school psychologist, the general education teacher, and a special education teacher. The student's disability classification will be determined through an evaluation process. And as I mentioned, the IEP team will make the ultimate determination of whether or not the student is eligible for special education services. In order to be eligible for special education services, as you can see on the side of the screen, on the left side for eligible, the student must meet the criteria for one or more of the disability classifications, which we'll discuss today, and require a special education program or related service by reason of at least one of his or her disabilities. So they need to have one of the disabilities, meet the criteria for that, and they need to have the support of a special education program. The student would not be eligible for special education services if they do not meet the disability classifications. They do not, or perhaps they do meet the criteria for the disability classifications, but they don't need a program to support them in their educational program. Or they're not meeting general education standards because of one of the following reasons. If there's a lack of appropriate instruction at the school in reading, um, in phonics, vocabulary, reading comprehension, or lack of appropriate instruction in math, or the student has limited English proficiency, that would not make the student eligible for special education services. So just to recap again, even though a student may have a disability, they may meet one of the criteria for disability classification, but if they are progressing in their program with the supports that are there, or they're not progressing, but it's not because the student's disability, but rather it's because the program that's being offered is not appropriate, or the student lacks English proficiency, that would not be the criteria for special education. And we'd have to look at other ways to support the student. So I wanted to take a minute just to talk about the process for 3K and pre-K. Some parents that are joining us today may have children that are going through that process or have gone through that process. It's similar but slightly different from school age. So firstly, if a child is found eligible at the preschool level, the classification on the IEP will be listed as preschool student with a disability. We wouldn't be writing anything such as autism, learning disability at that age. That would not go on the IEP. We would classify every student as a preschool student with a disability. And in order to qualify for services at the preschool level, the student must be found to have a significant delay in one of the 5 areas, either cognitive, which is their thinking and learning, their language and communication, their ability to understand and use language, their adaptive skills, which is their self-help skills, such as dressing, eating, toileting, their social emotional development, how they get along with others and express their feelings, their motor development could include as well vision, their hearing, their mobility, how they're able to navigate and get around. If they are significantly delayed in any one of those areas, they would qualify for preschool special education services. And when we talk about significant delay, we're looking at a percentage of 33% or more in one of those areas, which typically translates into a year behind in development. In addition, they can also be qualified for special education services if they meet the criteria of one of the following disabilities. If they meet the criteria for autism, deafness, deafblindness, hearing impairment, or any of these other ones that are listed here, they could also qualify for preschool special education services. And in addition, they show that they need a special education program to support their learning. So a word of caution, and I kind of been referencing it throughout the previous slides already. Just because a student meets the criteria for one or more of the disability classifications does not necessarily mean that they require a special education program or related service by reason of that disability. For example, if we have a student who meets the criteria for other health impairment, but they're receiving medication that allows him or her to make the progress in the general education curriculum without a special education program, then we would not give them special education services. We would support them with the programs that are available for them in the general education setting. Another point to mention is that any student, including a student in a gifted and talented program or other enrichment or accelerated program, or a student that's advancing from grade to grade, can be eligible to receive special education programs or services if they're not making the progress that's anticipated based on their needs, and they qualify, they meet the criteria that we had mentioned in the previous slides. So being in a specialized program such as gifted and talented does not preclude them from getting that extra support. So now we move into the disability classifications. These are the 13 disability classifications. As I mentioned, the IEP team identifies the category disability that most affects the student's educational performance. So there are times where a student might meet criteria for one or more of these classifications. It will be up to the team, together with the parent, to decide which one most affects their educational performance and choose the disability based on that, the classification. We're talking about school age students now, so students between the ages of 5 and 21 years old. And it's definitely put this on the IEP as opposed to the preschool students. On the IEP for your school age student, you would see one of these classifications listed over there that identifies them as being eligible for special education services. So let's start going through the different classifications. On each of these slides, as we go through the classifications, what you'll see is a actual definition of the classification and then some more information about the classification, which we'll discuss. So the first one we have here is autism. And autism is a range and includes different students at different points on that range. It's characterized by a developmental disability that significantly affects verbal and nonverbal communication and social interaction. And this adversely affects the educational performance of the student. It's generally evident before the age of 3. Um, it's important to know that this is a educational classification of autism. So while there may be students or children that are diagnosed by a medical doctor with a classification of autism, this is slightly different than that. The way we're coming to this classification is through observations of the student, evaluations, educational evaluations, as well as rating scales where we're getting information from the parents, from teachers, from the student sometimes as well. And we're making that determination if they fall under the characteristics of autism. And we would put that on the IEP. Some other characteristics that we see with autism would be an engagement in repetitive activities and stereotype movements. So we see the student, engage in these repetitive acts, resistance to environmental change or change in daily routines. So these students may tend to be very rigid in their daily activities and become very aroused when there's a change that's presented to them, or unusual responses to sensory experiences. That could be a high sensitivity to sound, a high sensitivity to touch or different materials. So we might see those characteristics as well when we see a student with this classification of autism. Okay, the next classification is deaf blindness. And this is characterized by a combination of both hearing and visual impairments in the student. And the combination of the hearing and the visual impairment results in severe communication and other developmental and educational needs that cannot be accommodated in a special education program solely for students with deafness or students with visual impairment or blindness. So because they have this combination, they cannot just be in, let's say, a school for the deaf. In order to make this classification, we need to see that criteria, but we also require medical documentation. So as we'll see from our slides, there are a few classifications here that we would require medical documentation in order to make this decision. Deaf blindness would be one of those examples. We would need either or both an ophthalmological examination from an eye doctor, an audiogram from an audiologist, um, and as an example, those can be used to make this classification of deaf blindness. Next on the list of classifications is deafness. And in this case, it's characterized by hearing impairment. So there's no visual impairment in this case, it's only hearing impairment. However, the hearing impairment is so severe that it impairs the processing of linguistic information through hearing, with or without amplification, and adversely affects educational performance. So it's not just, this is a severe hearing deficit or that the student has. And once again, we would have to have medical documentation in order to classify them in this manner. Um, Aside from the special education programs and services that we would provide to other students, When it comes to a student that's classified with deafness, we also do have services that can be provided by an audiologist or by a teacher of hearing. And we have specialized hearing services that can be provided even in a community school for these students who meet this classification. A student with this classification might also be eligible for an amplification device, such as an FM unit, that they can be using in their classroom or their school setting. Okay, the next classification is emotional disturbance. And this classification has one or more, the student would exhibit one or more of the following characteristics and exhibit them over a long period of time and to a marked degree that adversely affects educational performance. So we're not talking about just, a student that's coming in one day and having an outburst. This is something that's over a long period of time, and it's really adversely affecting their learning. So in the box, you can see that we would see an inability to learn that cannot be explained by intellectual, sensory, or health factors because it's emotional. An inability to build or maintain satisfactory interpersonal relationships with either peers and teachers. We would see inappropriate types of behavior or feelings under normal circumstances. We may see a generally pervasive mood of unhappiness or depression with the student, and we might see a tendency to develop physical symptoms or even fears that are associated with personal or school problems. Again, this would be a classification that we would not make lightly for a student. We would want to get as much information as possible in terms of, like I said before, with evaluations, observations, any outside information that the parent would provide, we would consider that as well. Perhaps the student is seeing a professional, a medical professional outside the school. We want that to have that information as well so that we can come to the best determination whether or not the student actually meets the criteria for emotional disturbance. In many cases, students with emotional disturbance would need a specialized program that can really address their specific needs. So we want to make sure that we are making the correct classification. It's important to note, this is a slide of caution again, that social maladjustment by itself is not a basis for an emotional disturbance classification. So when we talk about social maladjustment, we're referring to behavioral manifestations that negatively affect educational performance, such as where the student may have a dysfunctional family background, right? They may be coming from a home where there's dysfunction, and they have a tendency to respond more quickly to negative sanctions than to positive rewards. Or they may have some gang involvement or truancy where they're not coming to school, right? And as we'll see from the other points on this slide, these in and of themselves does not mean that the child has an emotional disturbance. He may, she may, and we have to take that into consideration. But just because they have one of these symptoms does not necessarily mean that they have an emotional disturbance. So we have to make sure that we're not confusing a social maladjustment where they're not your typically social student or child, as opposed to a full-blown emotional disturbance. Other things that we might see are irritability or anger, which are used manipulatively to control people and situations. Sometimes there'll be obscene and degrading language and gestures that the student is using. Sometimes they'll use verbal and physical aggression towards peers and adults. Um, they may have an unusually high self-esteem, but still be very fragile. If distress occurs, it's situational and usually related to being held accountable. So they have trouble with dealing with that kind of stress. They may have refusal to take personal responsibility and have a tendency to blame others for situations. They may have values and morality that are determined by the situation and whatever they want. So meaning they just look for immediate gratification. They just want to do what they want to do at that moment without thinking about the consequences. A student with a social maladjustment might have substance and alcohol abuse. They may be using any of those things. They may have a lack of empathy or remorse. So it's kind of like we describe it as having no conscience, where we say that the child just doesn't care about what happened, or the student doesn't care. Or they may have close thinking pattern, so they're not interested in others' opinions or judgments in areas such as responsible living. They're not able to look at themselves in a critical way or respond to suggestions from other people that are providing that to them. And again, this may be a full-blown emotional disturbance, but we have to really consider whether or not the student may be going through some type of experience or dealing with something, whether in school, personally, or at home. And we can see if we can address that, or if this may actually be signs of something greater. Okay, the next classification is hearing impairment. So this is not deafness, as we mentioned before. This is a hearing impairment. So this refers to whether it may be permanent or fluctuating hearing impairment that adversely affects the educational performance, but is not included under the definition of deafness. Um, again, there may be other reasons that the student is going through this, either permanently or even for a short period of time, where they're having their hearing that is impaired. Once again, we would need medical documentation in order to make this classification. We would need a medical professional to give us that paperwork that we would consider and review to make this determination. And the supports that they would receive may be similar to a student with deafness as well, just maybe at a lower intensity. Okay, the next classification is learning disability. It's important to know that this term does not include learning problems that are primarily the result of limited English proficiency or the result of a visual, hearing, or motor disability or intellectual disability, emotional disturbance, or environmental or economic disadvantage. So we want to make sure when we're making a classification of learning disability that we're looking at it for the right reasons and really understanding why the student has this deficit. So a disorder of learning disability would be in one or more of the basic psychological processes involved in understanding or in using language, spoken or written, that manifests itself in an imperfect ability to listen, to think, to speak, to read, to write, to spell, or do mathematical calculations. All of the things that we need to learn. Okay, and it may include such conditions as perceptual disabilities, brain injury, dyslexia, developmental aphasia. Those would all fall under this classification of learning disability. Now, when we talk about the classification, there is a procedure. We would not rely on any one single procedure as the sole criteria for determining whether a student has a learning disability. We would have to include an observation of the student in routine classroom instruction, monitoring the student's performance. We have to have the observation conducted by at least one person who's qualified to conduct diagnostic examinations of a student. That could be a school psychologist. It could be the teacher of speech improvement or a reading teacher. And it's very important, you'll see the bold lines on the bottom of the box, that the IEP must consider in this kind of cases data that demonstrates the student was provided appropriate instruction by qualified personnel in a general education setting first. So we want to make sure that they had an appropriate program that was provided for them. There was a teacher that was, qualified to teach over there in that setting. The curriculum, everything was set up for them. They were attending the program. They were at the school. They had access to all of that. And there's database documentation of repeated assessments of achievement at reasonable intervals. So we have a lot of data to go with this. We're not just coming in, on the first week of school and saying, oh, he's not doing well. We're classifying him as a learning disabled child. Rather, we're seeing, have we given the student everything that they can have to succeed? And have we documented and assessed them at different points throughout this process to make sure that they're not able to move forward without more support? And then the team may determine based on all that a student has a learning disability if, when provided with learning experiences and instruction that's appropriate for the student, that the student does not achieve in any one of the areas on the left, which we mentioned already. Their oral expression, their listening comprehension, their reading comprehension, mathematics, all of those areas can fall under this. So if we see that after being provided with the education program, they're not making progress, and the student does not make progress, even though we've given them research-based interventions, prior to special education, or we see that the student exhibits a pattern of strengths and weaknesses in performance that the team determines to be relevant to the identification of a learning disability based on appropriate assessments, then they would qualify for this. So that's a lot. There's a lot of information on the slide, but the basic understanding of this is that we're not just saying that a student that's struggling in class is now classified as a student with a learning disability. What we're saying is that we have a student that's being provided with all the supports. We've seen they need a little extra help, and we've given them research-based interventions, and we've used appropriate assessments to determine whether or not that's helping. And if we come to all that, we've done all those steps, then we can say that the student has a learning disability because they're not making the progress that they should be making based on their grade, based on their level, based on their developmental stage. So the next classification is an intellectual disability. So this is characterized by significantly sub-average general intellectual functioning. So we're talking about very significant low functioning of a student that would be based on assessments. And it's existing concurrently with deficits in adaptive behavior. As we said before, adaptive would refer to kind of their self-help behaviors where the student is able maybe to take care of themselves, get dressed, use the bathroom, right? Those feeding themselves. And we see significant delays in all of those areas, as well as, them being able to advocate for themselves. All of those areas, if we see significant low performance, may be the criteria for an intellectual disability. Um, this is a severe disability. And so, even more than a learning disability, this will take a longer process to determine whether or not the student has an intellectual disability to be sure that we are making the right classification. This is a classification that we should see low incidence of. So we would not see a majority of students in our schools with this type of disability because it is a very severe level of disability. Okay, so the next disability is multiple disabilities. That's the next classification. And this is characterized by concomitant impairments, the combination of which causes major educational needs that cannot be accommodated in a special education program specifically designed to address one of the impairments. So what that means is that the student has more than one of characteristics of disabilities, right? And we're not talking here about deaf blindness that we spoke about in the beginning of the presentation, but we see other characteristics of other disabilities joined together, and it's significantly affecting their progress and their ability to learn. So typically, the classification would denote a severe intellectual disability in addition to another significant area of disability. So you might have a student that's very low cognitively and they have an intellectual disability, and at the same time, they may have an orthopedic impairment. So they may have, trouble functioning with their mobility, getting around on their own, or they may have an emotional disturbance where we're seeing a lot of negative behaviors that are coming from them in addition to their intellectual disability. A student like that may qualify for this classification of multiple disabilities. Now, in this case, also, we would need a medical evaluation for the student. For example, an orthopedic assessment, if that's the area that we're looking at, as well as an adaptive behavior scale may be required, where we're looking about if we're looking at their emotional deficits in this area, then we would have that also. So we're going to gather multiple types of information to make that determination whether or not they would fall under this category of multiple disabilities. The next classification is orthopedic impairment, and this would be characterized by severe physical impairment that adversely affects a student's educational performance. So this can include impairments caused by congenital anomaly. So let's say they were born, missing a limb, or impairments that were caused by disease like bone tuberculosis, excuse me, or impairments from other causes. So, for example, they have cerebral palsy, okay, or a different neuromuscular disorder. or an amputation where a limb was removed, right? Any of those types of things might fall under orthopedic impairment because it's really affecting their physical development and their physical progress. In this case, also a medical evaluation would be required to make this classification. So we would need, a doctor information from a doctor, an evaluation, in order to be able to classify the student in this area. Other health impairment. The disability classification of other health impairment is characterized by impaired strength, vitality, or alertness that results in limited alertness with respect to the educational environment. This impairment must be due to chronic or acute health problems, and it includes, but it's not limited to, the following things that you'll see. For example, if the student has a heart condition, asthma, epilepsy, diabetes. Somebody had asked on our last presentation about ADHD. That's right here, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or attention deficit disorder, ADD. Those would all fall under other health impairment. So, in this type of a classification, we're seeing a student with any of these types of conditions, and of course, the impairment has to adversely affect their educational performance. I'll use ADHD as an example. If a student has ADHD and they've been prescribed medication by their doctor and they're able to fully function in the classroom setting, they would not qualify for other health impairment or for special education services. So that's why we say that the impairment must adversely affect their educational performance. Um, and that would be the same with any of these conditions. It's not just enough to have the condition. We need to see how now that condition is affecting them in their learning. The next classification is speech or language impairment. And this impairment includes a communication disorder, such as stuttering, impaired articulation, so the way the student is pronouncing their words, language impairment, or whether or not they have deficits in their receptive language, their understanding of language, or their expressive language, how they use language, or it could be a voice impairment, um, the way they're producing the sounds could be a characteristic as well that it adversely affects their educational performance. Um, a speech and language evaluation would be required to make this classification. So we would need, as part of the team, a speech pathologist or a speech teacher to evaluate the student and use that information to be able to make this classification. It's important to note, we get this question a lot where we have students who may present with certain articulation issues or even stuttering to a certain degree, and they may or may not qualify. The gauge will be how this is affecting their learning. So if they have an issue with producing certain sounds, the question would really be looking at everything and how that's really affecting their participation and their learning in the school environment. Okay, traumatic brain injury is the next classification, and this classification is characterized by an acquired injury to the brain, which was caused by an external physical force or by certain medical conditions, with resulting impairments that adversely affect educational performance. So again, this is something that happens later on in a child or student's life. And a medical evaluation is required to make this classification as well. For example, a neurological might be appropriate in this case in order to determine if the student does qualify for this classification of traumatic brain injury. The classification may include either open or closed head injuries or brain injuries that from certain medical conditions, resulting in mild, moderate, or severe impairments in one or more of the following areas: cognition, language, memory, their attention, their thinking, their abstract thinking, their problem solving, their speech, their sensory and motor abilities, their physical functioning. All of that can be affected by this traumatic brain injury. And if it is affected in a mild, moderate, or severe way, they may qualify for this classification of traumatic brain injury. Once again, it does not include injuries that are congenital or caused by birth trauma. That wouldn't be a traumatic brain injury because traumatic brain injury would occur after later on in the child's life. However, if they do have, something that was caused by birth, they may fall under one of the other characteristics. Okay, and the final classification that we'll discuss is the disability classification of visual impairment. And this is characterized by an impairment to vision that, even with correction, adversely affects educational performance. And this would include both partial sight and blindness. Once again, we would need a medical evaluation, usually by an optometrist or an ophthalmologist, to provide the documentation to qualify for this classification. And again, it may include partial sight and blindness. And again, even with correction, like it says, so even if they have some kind of tool, maybe they have, either corrective lenses, or they're using even some type of an assistive technology to support them, they may still qualify for this classification, even though they're getting those extra things to correct that deficit. Along with that, they may need this visual impairment. They may need vision services, which is something that we can provide them under this classification also. And in certain cases, they may need to attend a special program for students with visual impairment as well. So that's a lot of information. We went through 13 classifications. Like I said, you may hopefully have a better understanding of that. And if your child does have an IEP, hopefully you'll understand better why they fell under that classification that they have on their IEP. Before we go into the questions, I just want to mention that our contact information for the district is here as well. So if anybody has any, maybe more personal, specific questions that you need to follow up with after the presentation, you can always reach out to us. My information again was on the first slide. We'll go there again in a minute. And for now, I will open it up to questions. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat, and I will read them and answer them. Or if you are, okay with just unmuting, you can unmute yourself and feel free to ask a question. And I ask if the interpreters, if in any of your rooms you have any questions as well, just to unmute and let us know. So I see there's one question from Laura's iPhone. If there's no diagnosis, but the child qualifies for services, who chooses the diagnosis and how is it chosen? Thanks for the question, Laura. So I'm assuming you're talking about a medical diagnosis. We did talk about medical diagnosis a few times. So there are a few classifications where we would require medical documentation, right? So for example, the visual impairment, the hearing impairment, those types of things we would require medical documentation. However, it's important to understand that even when we require the medical documentation, an IEP is not a medical program, and we're not making a medical classification when we're providing that IEP or that classification. All of our classifications are educational classifications. We're providing an individualized educational program. So this would be different than a medical model that might be provided to a student. And we even have students that may be receiving school-based services and then getting other services in some other medical type setting or hospital setting, and that's okay. So when we say that we need medical documentation, that's in order to consider that classification. And then the IEP team, like I mentioned, will look at that along with the other information that they have, any assessments that they've done, observations, any parental interviews, teacher interviews, and they would come up with the classification for that student. So I hope that answers your question. Any other questions? Feel free. I'm gonna go back to put my information up as well, just in case I might use that. You're welcome, Laura. Interpreters, if there's any questions in the other rooms.
No, so far I've asked a couple of times.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. And I should just mention that in our office, in the District 25 office, we do have both Mandarin speaking and Spanish speaking staff that can assist. If anybody has follow-up questions afterwards, you can always call the district line, like we mentioned, and you can ask for that language, and you will be assisted as well. Okay, if anybody has any questions, again, you can put in the chat or you can unmute. If you don't have any questions, you can stick around and see if anybody else does, or you can feel free to go. This presentation will be uploaded to our site, to our district site, so you can always review it again. I know there was a lot of information here. Um, Hopefully give you a better understanding of your child's IEP, or if you're going through the process or will be going through the process, really understanding what that means, and what the classification. And something else I just want to point out is that something else to consider when we consider the classification is really, where that classification will take us. Sometimes, like I said, for certain things, for example, like emotional disturbance, we really want to be very careful that we're making the right decision, because that is obviously going to affect. It may affect the student for many years moving forward in terms of the types of programs that they're offered, the types of supports that they're offered, the types of schools that they're offered to support them. So I want to make sure that this is the most accurate information that we have. We have a question in Spanish in the chat. If I could have one of the interpreters maybe translate that for us.
Okay, so the question is, here in New York, is there a certification document for disability?
So for the student, I guess the IEP would be the document, what we've been speaking about, and there it would list, for school-based services, would list the disability that's there.
I think the contact it's a few parts, so I think maybe the whole thing would give more context. So first was asking about the certification document, and then the second was who gives the diagnosis? Is it a neurologist or a psychiatrist? And then specifically talking about a child with autism as the concern, and how could the school help me so that my child has more therapies and be able to have him regulated? So that's a little bit more of a specific question for a specific child. But anything else around just about the question about who's doing the actually doing the diagnosing?
Sure. So at the school level, we would have a school psychologist who would conduct the evaluation, and that their report would be used in order to determine the classification of, for example, autism, or any of the other classifications that don't require a medical documentation. Again, there are some students that have a medical diagnosis of autism, and that's fine. We would bring that to the school team and have them see that, and they would use that in addition to their evaluations and assessments and observations.
And then there was a last part which I put it in English in the chat, Nathan, so you can see it.
So
Again,
he's
it's
currently in a regular school, but in a special classroom, but they also determined he should go to a special school, and he has already applied for it, and we are waiting. Okay. So, in terms of going to a different school setting, just continue to follow up with your school. And if you need any support with that, reach out to me directly or to the district office, and we can support you with that as well. But we ask that you first speak with the school again just to see where they are. And if you're not getting through with that and you need more support, definitely reach out to myself or to the office.
And I think the most important thing for that is, you'll have the opportunity to visit the school, right, Nathan, and to see what it's like before you make a commitment to send your child to a special school or to a different school that maybe has different settings. So just know that you will have that opportunity to visit and to learn more about the school before you make those decisions. And I would encourage all parents in that situation to visit the schools and to see what they offer and what they're like.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, whenever we make an offer for a parent, it is an offer, and what we want is for you to go and see that offer and make the best decision for your child with all the information that you have. We can't really make that decision without actually seeing the program. So, we ask that you go. If a parent needs somebody from the school to go with them, we can always support you with that. You can ask the school if you need somebody to go with you. They can always go if it's a language or just for support to help you understand the program. That's fine. They do that regularly.
Yeah, and just remember, parents, that the special education process is something that you guys have an awful lot of say in, and you have your rights as parents. So part of that is asking questions. So if you're not sure, or if you're offered something and it doesn't seem right to you, you're able to ask those questions. So and we encourage you to do that as parents. So really super important.
Absolutely, and that's why we are having these meetings, these presentations, so that you are more knowledgeable in these areas and you can ask the right questions and have the support that you need. Okay, any other questions? Okay, again, everybody has the District 25 contact. If you want to follow up afterwards, you can definitely feel free to do that. You can email myself as well, or call, and we can answer any other questions that you may have. Again, I thank you all for participating tonight and joining our presentation. We will have another presentation, I believe in March, where we'll be talking about the kindergarten transition process. So we'll send that out soon, and hopefully we'll have you join again with that.
Thanks so much, everyone. We'll hang on in the event someone wants to hold back and ask a question, but otherwise, everyone have a great night. Thank you, Nathan, for putting on this presentation, and for the rest of the team for being here to support.
Yes, thank you.